today we're talking all about TELedvisor roles, names, and practices. So what are the kind of different names, practices, confusion around our roles, and the types of things that we get up to and the relationships we form between academic and professional roles and teams within our institutions. That's what we're talking about today. And we'll move on to Colin's presentation, which is looking at some of the tensions in the names and terminologies, I believe. Is that correct, Colin?
Let's go with that. It's there's a little bit of everything in there.
Terrific.
Yeah,
well,
thank you, Dom. That really was fantastic. Just very quickly, out of curiosity, and I guess we could just as easily do this in the chat, but I've put up the whiteboard now. Would you mind just typing up your current title? You should just be able to click the T and then click somewhere on the whiteboard. Educational designer. Actually, I should put mine up. I had to check mine. I'm an education support officer. It just doesn't sound particularly important. Oh, lecturer, technologist, educational technologist, education technology support specialist, learning designer. Yeah, all right. So there, you know, already we're seeing that there is a quite a range of different titles for the work that we're doing. So one of the things, so one of the things we were kind of wondering is how reflective of our practice are our titles. So I might take the whiteboard down now. So thank you for popping that up, and I'll pop the slides up. So yeah, hello, I'm Colin Simpson from the College of Business and Economics at the ANU. I run the Education Innovation Office. There's one person in the Education Innovation Office, and it's me. And I've been working with Kate and Chia, who are my co-conveners of this network. And you know, I mean, so we actually, yeah, so we set this group up. And one of the reasons that we actually did this was because I think there's a lot that we can learn from everyone. And so because there are so many different titles, one of the things that we first wanted to work out was some kind of an umbrella title for who we are. And, you know, we were playing around with TEL support or TELedvisors, and someone sort of felt that support didn't sort of reflect our agency. And so we kind of landed on edvisors, which is a combination of educators and advisors. So we've got another title to throw into the mix. But yeah, as you've seen, there are a lot of different titles being sort of bandied around in this space. So many titles. So Kate and Chia and I have actually been working on a little concise paper for Ascolite 2017. And so where we started was actually sort of digging into the literature a little bit. Thank you. Just to see what the most common titles are, and academic developer was by far the clearest. I think there's actually an international journal of academic development, and so they're very sort of switched on. And of all of these titles, I think academic developer is kind of the most obvious one, and we'll sort of spell that out a little bit later. And then we've got designer kind of positions, and there are learning, instructional, e-learning, education, whatever designers. And then there's also technologists, so education technologists, learning technologists. Now, one of the things that Bird found was that a lot of these terms are being used synonymously. In broad terms, an academic developer does a bit of curriculum development, primarily focuses on training and staff capacity building. What we found in the literature was there wasn't a whole lot of reference to technology. Your designer is kind of a little bit more hands-on, perhaps a little bit more theoretical in terms of what they're building, looking at sort of pedagogical approaches and starting to design learning resources. There's a little bit more technology involved in this. And then moving on to the technologist, obviously, as you would expect, it's a very technologically focused kind of role, often linked to systems. And one of the things that came up quite often is that some academics will see it only as a technical role, and learning technologists out there who have probably done further study in education or whatever, sort of understandably feel a little bit miffed by that. So we decided to use a couple of, or explore a couple of theoretical approaches to try and dig down and to better understand what these roles are, given that the titles are fairly difficult. So social practice theory is something I've been looking at recently. In a nutshell, it's basically saying that a practice is comprised of elements that you need to have, and those elements are sort of the material things, like a skateboard. It's the competences, so the ability to ride a skateboard, and it's the meaning, so the fact that surfers didn't always have an opportunity to go to the beach, so skateboarding sort of was helpful in that instance. So having these three elements is a really core part of what makes practice. And hopefully looking at a practice lets us to have a better sense of what it is that people do. So we went through, and this was a fairly, we're a bit sort of fast and loose with some of this. I mean, okay, I was a bit fast and loose with some of this, and there's definitely room for improving the methodology that we worked through. However, broadly speaking, we looked at job ads for people in these kind of roles between 2012 and 2017, just from a Google search. 37 ads in across 13 Australian universities. We came across 25 different job titles. And from that, we're able to sort of sift out 7 main practices. Now you'll see that design and develop, or design/develop, is kind of there as a practice in its own right. And this is kind of because to sift out these practices, what I did is kind of went into the duty statements rather than the selection criteria, and that's something to discuss in a moment. Interesting that the strategic element is missing as well. Well, it kind of comes under lead manage, sorry. So we sort of use this analytical approach, text analysis, whatever it was, and focused on what was actually being said. Now, in some of the duty statements, design and develop were, sort of in the same sentence. In other places, it was only develop. In other places, it was only design. Quite often, there was a reference to develop staff capabilities, which we sort of took to being different to develop, as in, build a website. So we kind of converted that to train, because, so as I say, we can, go into a bit more discussion about the methodology, but essentially these are the primary practices that we identified. Now, there were other practices included in the position descriptions, like communicate or work in a team, but we felt that they're fairly generic and, they don't necessarily define people in our kind of roles. So this is kind of tiny, but I do like color coding because it tends to make things a little bit easier. So then we sort of looked at how many instances there were. I mean, yeah, absolutely. If there are other practices that you think are significant, please let us know. So we kind of looked at how many references there were to a specific practice within the job ad for these different things, and those are the ones that are highlighted white. And so we kind of felt like these were seen as the primary practices of people in those positions. And as you can see, they're kind of scattered all over the place, and they're really not necessarily connected to the titles. So a few sort of interesting things that we found were that of the 37 positions, train and then support advise were really prominent. They appeared in 31 of the 37. So that's definitely seen as a very significant part of our role, sort of across the board. And research and evaluate also appeared in 28 of the 37. Now, obviously there's academic kind of research, you know, where you're expected to go off and write papers and do bits and pieces. But there was also a lot of stuff about, you know, evaluate pedagogical practices or evaluate technology. And for me, at least, research and evaluate seem to be comprised of the same kind of skill sets. So we kind of bundled those together. And then lead and manage appears in 8 of the 37, which are the more senior positions. Now, in terms of the academic developers, as I say, this is probably the clearest kind of, most clearly defined role in the literature, and that kind of stood up in the job ads. They all had train as a primary practice. Designers, that was just all over the shop. There were 12 positions. They were all professional positions, and I haven't sort of touched on the fact that some of these positions are professional and some of them are academic. That is pretty significant. Only one of the whatever designer positions actually had design as a primary practice. So even within the designer positions, there was an expectation that people would be doing a lot of other things. One had design develop, and the others really varied from advice support to research to develop to train. So there's lots of text popping up, which is great, but I can't read them and keep talking. So I hope you don't mind if I come back to them. And then, yeah, there are only 2 positions for technologists, and they were both professional, and the primary sort of practices there were advice support and develop, and they were much more technologically oriented. Now, don't worry about, well, so, and we had some discussions about how to actually present some of this data. For now, if you just look at the fact that, so what I did was kind of color code the positions and their kind of rankings, you know, in university pay scales, hierarchies, whatever else. But you can see there's a lot of different primary practices kind of scattered for the positions right across, up and down from a level C to a HEW2. And so I think this is kind of an interesting way of actually just getting a feel for where the positions sit and you know, sort of how they're perceived. As you can see, the green ones are the academic developer positions, and they are at the higher end of the pay scale. The designer positions kind of sit there a little bit more in the middle. Technologists, pretty lowly paid. I wouldn't be, you know, sort of calling myself a technologist if I had a choice. And the other ones, are, all the other titles are, you know, fairly well spread across the whole spectrum. So clearly, what we found out of this was that the primary dominant practices aren't always reflected in the titles. This lack of clarity probably means that overall we have less influence because the people that we're working with don't actually know what we can offer and what we can do, which may lead to some tensions. And a thought that I had just this morning as I was putting these slides together was that this probably actually doesn't help the university either. And actually, it was interesting that Dom brought this up as one of the concerns that KDAD had. If you are advertising a position and you want a particular type of person, and that person isn't searching for all of the variations and all of the different titles, maybe they're not even going to find your job ad. On the other hand, in some ways, this lack of clarity and this ability to kind of freestyle the job means that we do get a little bit more variety in our roles, and maybe we can even steer things a little bit more because no one entirely knows what we should be doing. So, you know, there are actually some pluses to this too. Now, I've just thrown this in because this was a bit of an ongoing debate that we had in the team, in the paper. So we left this bit out of the paper, and I'd certainly appreciate any thoughts on how we might address this. In a nutshell, my feeling is that if we look at roles, and maybe it's more a question of the perception of the roles than the actual nature of the roles, but either way, my feeling is that they occupy a space on this kind of spectrum between pedagogical and technological. And one of the things that I did in the analysis was actually try to quantify that, which is how we ended up with, let me just go back a couple. So you see at the top of the screen there is actually a series of numbers that goes from, you know, 1 to 8.6. So I actually managed to give the different positions a score based on, you know, maths and magic and stuff. But I found it kind of interesting as a way of just getting a sense of at least how the positions are perceived. And you'll see that in the professional area, there's a lot more positions down the more technological end. There's more positions sort of towards the pedagogical end in the academic side of things. So again, so this was my take. Now, not everyone on the team agreed with this, and I'm certainly open to having this discussion. So I did think that there might be a different way to actually explore it, which is trying to measure them from low technological to high, and then low pedagogical to high. And so I suspect that we'll probably still find that they're in, you know, two of the 4 quadrants. So yeah, so where do we go here? So this has been really interesting, sort of looking into this. So I think we definitely need to refine the way that we analyse the ads, because the language that you use, you've really got to, you know, interpret. And the fact that people talk about developing, you know, capacity, clearly it's not development as a practice, it's training. But then, you know, there's all of these other things that you've got to do to unpack the language that gets used. Do we look at the selection criteria, or do we look at the list of duties? I kind of lean towards the duties, because I think that the selection criteria, I don't know, the selection criteria is kind of what you want the person to have done, and the duty statement is what you think they will be doing. Again, comments are most welcome. Obviously, we want to analyse and map a bigger collection of job ads. And I think, and again, I was glad to hear. I think it was Dom sort of talking about this, getting people in positions to actually evaluate how accurate their position description is in terms of what they actually do. Yes, so, and again, something I didn't really touch on was the difference between professional and academic roles in this space. And there's probably something about TPAC that might help us to unpack this technological, pedagogical spectrum thing. But again, that was a fairly recent idea, so it hasn't gone much further than that. So yeah, that was pretty much, yeah. So questions and suggestions, and maybe I can actually go through and see what everyone's been talking about in the chat.
I think some of it's great discussion that's been coming up in the chat, Colin. Some of it's probably I don't know, Wednesday afternoon either's hitting us. There's some fun things happening in there as well. But I think there's been a few interesting questions, I guess, around. Let's just see. Let's go and have a look. If anyone wants to jump in and use the mic, feel free while I have a look at some of these earlier questions.
I suppose one of the early things that Colin was talking about was around the 7 main practices that we found for the paper, and I suppose I'm wondering what people thought about that. Did anyone pick up of any other practices that are found in the third space? And one of the things that you said, Kate, was innovating practice. What did people think about that? Maybe we can put some verbs, action verbs, in the chat if you have any, or write on the board. Thank you, Colin.
Just in relation to that, while people are writing some things on the board, if you do want to grab the mic for any, at any point, just raise your hand. I guess one point that Colin made was that we didn't look at any of those what arguably and sometimes frustratingly get called soft skills, like communication, problem solving, teamwork. In the literature reading that I looked at, that became a bit of a theme that actually became the high priority skills for a lot of these roles. So even though it's maybe they're not the skills that define those roles as being unique, they may be the skills that are the most highly important in those roles. And I guess that's another potential route to look at in terms of how highly or how prominently those roles feature those skills, and maybe compared to other skills like design and develop.
Sure. So we got advocacy, problem solve, innovate, collaborate, improve, testing, teamwork. Yeah, and I mean, look, I certainly don't deny for a second that the so-called soft skills are crucial, because we're in an environment where we're doing a lot more collaborative kind of work. I guess, yeah, I think it's important. I'm still not sure whether it it helps to specify, and particularly if we would, I mean, like, I have no idea how this would pan out, but one of the things that I'd like to see is some kind of definitive definition of a learning designer, which is you do A, B, and C, and D, and you can also do these other things maybe. But I mean, maybe this is falling into the trap of language. And I mean, the fact that we still talk about blended learning, online learning, flexible learning, e-learning, all of these other kinds of things, we can't agree on anything, which is maybe why I like technology enhanced learning, but then digital learning is probably just as effective.
Wendy, did you want to pick up the mic?
Hi, Colin and crew. Thank you for a very interesting talk. I guess just what you said, Colin, there, and in relation to some of the previous chat, do you think in the uncertainty or some of the confusion around job roles can also impact, so Kahiwa and myself have mentioned university restructures and how that perhaps positions could be lost or move sideways and things like that because of the gap between what might be recruited for and what's actually done.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's. I mean, there are so many potential problems that come from institutions not understanding, well, firstly, what we actually do day to day, and secondly, what we can, what our potential is. That, yeah, having that kind of clarity is definitely vital. And I think when we set up the TELedvisors network, one of our initial goals was to better advocate for people in these kind of roles so that there is a deeper understanding of what we're about. Don't you think there's a space that allows people to build specialisation within that umbrella? Oh, sure. But yeah, I mean, look, my manager's a great bloke. He runs the IT team and the infrastructure team. He doesn't entirely know what my job is.
Are there any other, I guess, final questions? And remember that I'm hoping, Dom's still in the room. So if you had any other further questions for Dom as well, here's your chance.
It's Tom Worthington here.
Yes, Tom.
I'm wondering if we could look at what instructional educational designers are trained in as a clue to what they do.
Yeah. Actually, I was going to talk a bit about. Well, actually, so Kate did the lit review part of the paper that we've been working on, and she probably dug into why instructional designers are different. Did you want to talk about that, Kate?
Yeah, sure. So like what others were saying here, instructional design seems to have a pretty strong history in the US, linked to sciences. Doesn't seem to get used as much here. Tends to be, I guess, a little bit more of a project-based focus. So the use of a subject matter expert originally came from the military, as Colin's put there. So it sort of has these connotations with more kind of cognitive learning theories, it's as opposed to, I guess, more constructivist learning theories, and a little bit more from an industry focus, particularly in more recent times, where I guess that brings up questions as to whether it's the best fit when you're working in higher ed, whether people want to align themselves with that name title or not because of those connotations and that history, especially when you're talking about the use of a subject matter expert, which I think here, would end up being the academic, but whether they want to be known as a subject matter expert or whether, I think in some ways it's a similar kind of process in that you're working with someone on a design and they have subject matter expertise, but it's about the collaborative relationship you set up, and in instructional design sometimes that may or may not be as collaborative. So I think that there's room to shift that bar, and I think that has happened in a lot of cases more recently, but historically it tended to be, I guess, a designer would be on a project and they would use a subject matter expert and they would put it together, and then it would be sent out, and then it would be trying to get evaluation or data back to find out how well that worked, as opposed to, I guess, what happens in unis, which tends to be a bit more of a collaborative relationship. So that's not to say that that term isn't sometimes used in that context, but historically it has a slightly different kind of use, if that makes sense.
Well, I was kind of thinking more generally, if you look at, I guess the underlying question is, are you trying to be professionals? In which case, a profession needs a code of ethics, a body of knowledge and all these other things. I'm used to doing this in the computer profession where we tried to bootstrap ourselves. So I'm just suggesting if we look at, what training the people who do these roles get as a clue to what they do.
I guess to look at the training that people get, we need to first really think about what we're expecting them to do, because you can't be trained in something unless you actually know what it is that you're trying to do.
No, I'm suggesting do it the other way around. Look at what is offered in the courses, programs which such people do, and that's one way to define what they do.
Yeah. I think if you spoke, if everyone, even in this chat room, told you their journey to becoming a learning designer or an education technologist or whatever, it would be really varied and really different. And actually, Dom's, one of the questions in Dom's survey was talking about what postgraduate study people had done, and I think there must have been at least a dozen different disciplines represented in that.
I think.
So I don't think that there is I think there are a handful of e-learning designer masters or postgrad courses or whatever now, but for the most part, you kind of bring together a collection of experiences and knowledge that you've gained in hundreds of different areas, and it just kind of works in the role.
It also is a bit contextual in that the US has a bit of a history with the term instructional design, and so you will see instructional design courses. UK tends to use learning design, and that's where things like CMALT and some of the, the Ascolite learning design SIG are kind of aligned to that. In Australia, it seems to be a little bit, a little bit vaguer, and I don't know. Certainly Dom would probably have a better understanding of, I guess, where people's qualifications are coming from. But for myself and the people in this group and people I've talked to in my work context, it seems like none of us have come with formal quals in this area. We've come with, from sidestepping from a different field, which is, so it's kind of a bit of an interesting one in Australia, I think.
One of the interesting stories I heard in the area was a group recruiting a bond, and they put in a relevant tertiary qualification, and they were really interested not in the qualification itself, but why people argued their qualification was relevant, and had no preconceptions about what would actually suit.
Yeah, that's actually one of the things I'm quite in. Just coming quickly back to the job ads, I didn't focus on it, but I did notice it, is because we were looking at jobs both for academics and for professional staff. I was wondering if there was an expectation that academics had done education degrees or postgrad degrees, and there seemed to be less of that than in the case of professional staff. Obviously it varied, but I think that's definitely an area for further research.
I think it's a negative, actually, based on recent experience. If you're qualified in education, then academics think less of you, I'm afraid.
But for the academic positions of the academic developers or lecturers that I've known, this is Chia here, most of the people in these academic positions tend to have the education background, so at least grad cert in higher ed, or school of ed, bachelor of ed, masters of education, that sort of level of qualification. One thing I picked up that Peter was talking about learning engineers as well, and Dom, you are talking about this in your paper, and Colin and Kate and I have been thinking about this as well. And I think that's one of the things that's popping up because of the impact that design thinking is making. That notion of designer being the problem solver, creating something that actually addresses the issues that we face, that really resonates with the notion of learning designers, the kind of work that we do. It's not just pedagogy or technology that we face, but also encompassing all kinds of problems. And that's why the skill sets that Kate was talking about in terms of soft skills are really useful in thinking about the learning engineers and designers roles, I think. I wonder if anyone had further thoughts on that.
Well, I was struck by, in doing a North American program in instructional design, the similarities to computer system design. So we actually were instructed in systems analysis, for example, which is a basic computing idea. So there seem to be a lot of similarities with software engineering, that sort of thing.
And I think that's partially because the instructional design model basically it came out of World War II. And the American Army was looking for ways to very effectively and efficiently train their troops, and so they took a very kind of behaviouralist kind of model, which was very much kind of drill stuff into people's head, and it does seem to have more of a quasi sort of scientific approach than some of the other like constructivism or something.
Well,
yeah.
I think I can see there's heaps of great comments still happening on the chat, but we're just about wrapping up. So could I just ask everyone to put their virtual hands together again for both of our speakers, Colin and Dom, for what's been a great discussion, and hopefully we can continue it in the Moodle space. So please think about how to keep that conversation going. I think there's been some really great, some contentious discussion, but some really great discussion and really respectful discussion. And I think that it really does show that there's still a need to unpack some of these questions through further research, and hopefully as a group we can continue to add to that space. So I think there may be some people hanging around to have a quick chat around other things, just related to other Ascolite stuff. But I hope that you have a great rest of the day, and please feel free to keep the conversation going in the Moodle discussion forum, and we'll make this video available later. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Kate. And for any other ideas for further webinars, please go ahead to comment on the discussions on the website, on the Moodle site.